Welcome back to the woods. Find a quiet place, maybe a cup of tea or something warm, and let's step together into a slower world, where the days pass gently and small creatures live simple, beautiful lives beneath the trees. The storm by the reed pond. Rain had been promised all week, and by morning the promise was kept. The forest woke to a curtain of water, soft at first, then heavier, soaking moss and bark until everything shimmered in shades of dark green and brown. The air smelled of wet leaves and river clay. By the edge of the reed pond, with a cattail swayed like sleepy sentries, the otter stood watching the ripples spread. His small shelter, made of driftwood and woven reeds, sat snug against a bend in the bank. He liked the rain, usually. It made the pond feel alive, pattering against the surface like 1,000 tiny footsteps. But today he frowned. The water was rising. He had noticed it the night before, creeping up the stones near his door. By morning, it had climbed over them. Now the edges of his garden patch, where he'd planted watercress and tiny wild onions, were already underwater. He sighed, tail flicking. "Should have listened to the frog," he muttered. "He said we'd get a week of this." With a determined grunt, he pulled on his old oilcloth coat and made his way up the small slope behind his shelter. There, under a beech tree's wide canopy, stood the badger, pipe in paw, watching the same scene unfold with calm, patient eyes. "Morning," said the otter. "Morning," the badger replied. "Pond high, too high." The badger nodded slowly. "She'll spill over by dusk if this keeps up." "That's what I was afraid of," said the otter. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was thinking of moving the logs from the far side. Try to divert the water toward the marsh. That'll just flood the marsh." "Then what do you suggest?" The badger puffed on his pipe, thinking. "Sandbags. Where in the world am I going to get sandbags?" "Fox says old grain sacks. There's plenty in his shed, and the bank's sandy enough by the bend. I'll help." The otter hesitated, embarrassed. "You don't have to." "I know, but I will." And that was that. By midday, the rain had eased, falling now in light, silvery threads that hissed softly against the leaves. Together, the otter and the badger worked down by the bank. The otter filled sacks with damp sand and knotted them tight with reed cord. The badger, slow but strong, stacked them neatly into a short wall along the lowest edge of the pond. The frog arrived halfway through, hopping from puddle to puddle. "Told you it had come," he croaked cheerfully, though he carried a long fern leaf like an umbrella. "Need a hand? Got plenty of those, haven't you?" grunted the badger. "Very funny," said the frog, setting down the leaf. "I'll fetch more sacks." By late afternoon, the work was nearly done. The rain had thickened again, falling with renewed insistence, but the wall held. Water swelled up to the top of the sandbags, trembling there like glass before trickling away harmlessly into the grass beyond. The otter sat down heavily, panting, tail slick with mud. "That should do it." The badger nodded. A day's work well spent. The frog, perched on the nearest bag, looked around with satisfaction. "If it keeps raining, we might need another row." The otter groaned. "Don't even say that." They all laughed softly, the sound mingling with the rain and the rustle of reeds. Evening came early, as it always did on rainy days. The sky hung low, heavy and dark. Inside the otter's shelter, the air was thick with warmth and steam. He had set a pot of stew over the small iron stove. Mushrooms, wild carrots, and sprigs of thyme, the kind that grew in tufts along the stones by the water. The smell filled the room, earthy and rich. The badger sat near the door, rubbing his paws dry, while the frog, ever restless, peeked out the window at the rising mist. Still raining, he murmured. "Let it," said the badger. "The pond will hold." When the stew was ready, the otter ladled it into 3 bowls. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the patter of rain and the faint bubbling of the stove. After a while, the frog leaned back with a sigh. "I don't think I've ever been this full." Then you haven't been around the otter long enough, said the badger with a grin. He'll feed you till you can't move. Better full than cold, said the otter simply. He poured them each a bit of warm tea, brewed from dried mint and nettle leaves, and they drank slowly, the steam fogging the little window beside them. Outside, the pond gleamed like molten silver under the moonlight, swollen but calm. The sandbags held, the reeds bent low, whispering against the wind. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly, its voice round and steady. For the first time all week, the otter felt the knot in his chest ease. He looked at his friends, mud-streaked, tired but content, and smiled. Funny, he said, you spend a day fighting the rain, and by the end of it, you realize it wasn't an enemy after all. The badger looked up. It never is. The frog nodded drowsily. Just a reminder. A reminder of what? Asked the otter. The badger puffed out a breath, his eyes half closing. That everything's borrowed. Warmth, shelter, dry ground. We don't own them. We just take care until the weather changes. The otter thought about that for a long moment, staring at the glowing stove. Then he nodded slowly. Then I suppose today we did our part. You did, said the badger. We just lent our paws. The frog snorted softly. And my brilliant advice. They all chuckled again, and the sound, small and genuine, filled the little house with something brighter than the fire. When they finally turned in for the night, the rain had softened to a whisper. The world outside was washed clean, and the scent of wet reeds drifted through the cracks in the walls. Morning broke with a thin, silvery light. Mist coiled low over the pond, and birdsong returned, shy and bright. The water had receded slightly, leaving the sandbags dark and glistening. The otter stood outside, breathing deeply. The world smelled new again. From across the water, the hare called out, "The wall held, didn't it?" "It did," said the otter, grinning. The badger appeared beside him, pipe already lit. "Told you so." The frog splashed lazily into the shallows, laughing. "And the pond's bigger now. Think of the fishing." The otter looked at the shimmering surface, the reflection of the clouds drifting across it, and smiled quietly. Maybe the rain was worth it, after all. He turned back toward the others, tail flicking in contentment. "Breakfast at my place?" The badger grinned. "If there's tea, there's always tea." And with that, they disappeared inside again, the smell of toast and wild honey soon mingling with the crisp scent of morning rain. Outside, the forest gleamed, washed, renewed, and utterly alive. The rain passed, but the memory of it lingered in every corner of the woods. The paths were soft beneath paw and foot, and the scent of damp bark hung thick in the air. The reed pond, once restless, now shone smooth and broad, its edges marked with faint traces of the flood. A few stray leaves caught in branches, a fallen twig bridge washed clean. The otter woke early, before the light had properly filled the sky. He padded out from his shelter, stretching until his joints gave a soft, satisfying pop. The pond was calm now, only the faintest ripples tracing its surface where a breeze whispered across. For the first time in days, he could hear birds. They came tentatively at first, a blackbird, a finch, then by degrees the full choir returned. The air filled with sound again, as if the forest were clearing its throat after a long silence. The otter smiled, tail flicking lightly. "Good morning, you lot," he said softly. He walked down to the sandbag wall. The badger's work had held perfectly. The sand had settled, and moss was already beginning to creep over the edges. Small shoots of grass poked between the bags, defiant and new. As he stooped to inspect them, he heard the rustle of wet leaves behind him. The badger appeared, pipe unlit, a small bundle of tools under one arm. "You're up early," said the otter. "Couldn't sleep. The rain made the burrow smell like mushrooms. Not the worst smell in the world." "Depends on a mushroom," said the badger with a half smile. The otter chuckled and glanced toward the pond. "She's holding steady." "Good. but the path up to the meadows washed out. I passed the hare trying to hop over it, nearly lost her footing. "I'll help patch it," said the otter. "Bring a shovel," said the badger, setting his own tools down. "We'll need it." By mid-morning, the three of them, badger, otter, and hare, stood at the edge of the washed-out path. The slope down to the pond had turned into a slick, muddy channel. The hare, still damp from her near tumble, frowned down at it. "It's like pudding," she said. "Less sweet," grumbled the badger. The otter grinned. "Depends on your taste." They worked steadily, spreading gravel from the stream bank, setting stones where the water had carved grooves, and laying small planks of driftwood to firm up the footing. Every so often, the frog hopped by to offer unsolicited advice or encouragement, which the others mostly ignored. After several hours, the path was whole again, a narrow but sturdy ribbon of earth leading up toward the meadow. The hare tested it carefully, hopping twice, then nodded in approval. "Better than before," she said. "Feels firmer." "That's because it is," said the badger. "Sometimes it takes a bit of rain to teach the ground how to hold itself." The otter wiped his brow with the back of his paw. "That sounds like something you'd stitch on a pillow." "I might," said the badger, "if I had one." The afternoon grew mild and bright. The air shimmered faintly with warmth, and the scent of sun-warmed mud filled the clearing. The otter decided it was too fine a day to waste entirely on work. "Lunch by the pond?" he suggested. "Only if it's your turn to cook," said the badger. "It always is," said the hare with a grin. They gathered under the beech tree that overlooked the water. The otter brought a small wooden tray from a shelter, lined with slices of rye bread, fresh cress, and a jar of pickled roots he'd made the previous autumn. The hare brought dandelion greens and a few early berries, while the badger arrived last, carrying a small kettle for tea. The meal was simple but bright, each flavor a reminder that the forest, even after days of storm, always offered something back. They ate slowly, listening to the gentle trickle of runoff finding its way down the banks. A dragonfly hovered nearby, its wings flashing like blue glass. The frog appeared again, predictably late and dramatically hungry. "I see you started without me." "You were napping," said the hare. "Rest in my mind," corrected the frog. "Big difference." He settled down beside them and reached for a slice of bread. "What's this?" "Onion. Pickled root," said the otter. The frog bit and cautiously chewed and then blinked in surprise. "It tastes like the smell after it rains." The otter smiled faintly. "That's the vinegar. It keeps things bright." They lingered long after the food was gone, sipping tea and watching the light shift over the pond. The water gleamed amber where the sun touched it. A heron passed overhead, its shadow sliding over the reeds. Later, as the day began to fold into evening, the otter walked along the bank to where a fallen branch had caught against the stones. It had been washed in by the flood, broad, smooth, and pale, stripped of bark by the current. He bent to move it and noticed something glinting underneath. A smooth, flat stone, marked faintly with small circles, as if water had carved them patiently over many years. He turned it over in his paws, tracing the grooves with a claw. They were delicate, almost decorative. "What VE you found?" called the badger from a few paces away. "Just a stone," said the otter. The badger ambled over, looking closer. "Not just a stone. That's from the old riverbed. Haven't seen one of those in ages." The otter looked up. "How far downstream?" "Half a day's walk, maybe more. The flood must have carried it all the way here." The otter smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep it. A reminder." "Of what?" asked the frog, hopping closer. "That everything finds its way home eventually." The badger nodded approvingly. "That sounds like something you'd stitch on a pillow." The otter laughed softly, tucking the stone into the crook of a root by his door. The next morning dawned clear and gold. The reeds stood tall again, drying in the sun. The pond had shrunk back to its calm shape, and the air was full of the soft, whispering sound of insects at work. Life, as always, resumed its rhythm. The otter tended his garden, replanting what the flood had claimed. The badger patched a leak in his roof. The frog built himself a new perch by the shallows, a smooth, flat stone perfect for basking. By evening, the forest was quiet again, not with stillness, but with the deep, living hush of a place that had survived something and learned from it. As the otter sat by the pond, he could still see faint traces of the storm's reach. A branch leaning sideways, the darker tone of bark where water had risen. Yet none of it felt out of place. It was all part of the same story, the ebb and flow of the world, gentle and patient. He poured himself a cup of tea, the steam curling like breath in the cooling air. Somewhere behind him, the badger hummed low and tuneless, stacking firewood. The frog croaked a few notes, not quite a song, not quite a word. The otter smiled, his reflection rippling softly in the water. "Not a bad day," he murmured. The forest, bathed in fading light, seemed to agree. Summer deepened in slow, golden layers. The air grew thick with the scent of pine sap and river mud. Even the shadows seemed slower, stretched and heavy in the long afternoons. The otter had taken to waking before sunrise, when the mist still hung low over the pond and the world was pale and quiet. Those early hours were his favorite, when he could hear every ripple, every soft stir of the reeds. It was as though the forest hadn't quite woken yet, and for a little while, it belonged to him alone. He would swim slow circles across the pond, watching the light shift through the mist. When he tired, he'd float on his back, letting the gentle current carry him toward the shallows. It was a simple rhythm, but it filled him with a calm that the rest of the day often scattered. One morning, as he drifted near the beach roots, he noticed something strange, a faint shimmer under the surface. It wasn't the glint of sunlight. It was too steady, too deliberate. Curious, he dove down, paws slicing cleanly through the cool water. At the bottom lay something buried halfway in silt. A glass jar, cloudy and green with age, sealed tight with a lid of rusted metal. He pried it loose carefully, bubbles rising in a silver column as he swam up again. He surfaced, gasping lightly. "Now, what are you doing here?" he murmured to the jar. Inside was something folded, paper or maybe, but the lid was jammed shut, and he didn't want to risk breaking it until it dried. So he tucked it into a cloth sack and carried it back toward his den. By midday, the sun was already high, pressing down like a heavy hand. The otter sat in the shade of his doorway, carefully working at the jar with a knife tip until the seal gave way with a hiss. The lid came off, and he tipped the contents out onto a clean cloth. A folded letter, water-worn but legible, and a small pressed flower, so pale it was almost white. He blinked. A letter here? Who could have left it? The ink had run in places, but most of it was still there, written in looping handwriting. "If you find this, you're standing where I once stood. The pond used to be smaller, just a bend in the stream, but I built a dock here when I was young. I wonder what's left of it now. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's all changed. If you're reading this, I hope you're well. I hope you have friends here. I hope you listen to the frogs and know their songs. I hope this place still feels like home to someone." It was signed Only L. The otter read it twice, then a third time. There was something tender about it, something that made the whole pond seem older, deeper than he'd thought. Someone had loved this place long before him. He held the flower up to the light. It looked like a kind of clover, pressed flat but still faintly fragrant. He wondered what color it had been when fresh, white, maybe pink. The badger found him sitting there an hour later, staring at it. "Lost in thought?" he asked, leaning his shovel against the wall. "Found something," said the otter, handing him the letter. The badger adjusted his spectacles and squinted at it. When he finished reading, he exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like someone cared about this place as much as you do." "Do you think they lived nearby?" asked the otter. "Could be. Or maybe they were just passing through." Some creatures stay only long enough to fall in love with a place before they move on. The otter smiled faintly. That's a nice way to think about it. The badger shrugged. You're the one who likes poetic nonsense. That evening, the otter took a small lantern down to the dock and sat with the letter in his lap. The sky had gone soft and lavender, and fireflies began to blink above the water. He read the letter again, tracing the faded ink with a careful paw. The pond reflected the last of the light, gold and violet, and he imagined what it must have looked like years ago when Elle was here. Maybe there had been fewer reeds. Maybe the water had been clearer. Maybe the trees had been smaller, the air quieter. But it was still the same place, still full of frogs and wind and the smell of moss. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small wooden box inside his den. Next to it, he set the pressed flower between two pieces of glass so it wouldn't crumble. It felt right to keep them together. Days passed. The letter stayed on his mind, sometimes surfacing in quiet moments. The line, "I hope you have friends here." He did. He realized that now. The badger, the hare, the frog, they were all part of this place, as much as the reeds or the stones. And maybe that's what the letter had meant all along. The pond didn't just belong to whoever built it. It belonged to whoever cared enough to stay. One evening, the otter told the others about it as they sat by the water, sharing roasted roots and tea. "Do you think we should write one too?" asked the hare. "Something to leave behind?" "Wouldn't hurt," said the badger. "Could be nice for whoever comes next." The frog nodded sagely. "I'll dictate mine," he said. "I have excellent phrasing." They all laughed. The badger fetched paper from his burrow, and by the glow of the lantern, they began to write. Short notes, some serious, some silly. The hare wrote about the taste of spring grass and the best places to nap. The frog wrote 3 stanzas about the importance of self-confidence and the dangers of crows. The badger wrote about patience in storms and how to build a good roof. The otter wrote last. His words came slow but steady. "If you find this, you're not the first to love this place. You're standing where others have stood, listening to the same frogs, watching the same light on the water. Take care of it. It will take care of you." When they finished, they sealed their notes in a small glass jar, just like the one he'd found. The otter swam it out to the deepest part of the pond and let it sink slowly, watching as it disappeared into the dark. Weeks later, he would still think of it, sometimes of Elle, of the old dock, of all the quiet lives that had passed through this same patch of forest. The world turned, seasons shifted, and things changed, but something of every creature stayed behind, if only in the way the reeds bent with the wind or how the water carried light. And so, the pond remained, still, alive, and full of memory. Autumn came gently, as if not to disturb the quiet left behind by summer. The air grew sharper, and the forest took on the scent of damp earth and smoke. The pond, once busy with dragonflies and leaping fish, now reflected the slow drift of falling leaves. The otter had grown used to watching the change day by day. He'd sit near the water's edge after breakfast, cup of tea steaming in his paws, eyes on the faint ripples that the wind drew across the surface. The pond had become more than home to him now. It was a kind of story itself, one that spoke in stillness rather than words. One morning, the badger came trudging up the path with a wheelbarrow full of old timber. "Storm coming tonight," he grunted. "Figured I'd patch the roof while I still can." The otter nodded toward the dark horizon. "I can help if you like. The boards by the chimney looked a bit loose last time I was over." "Wouldn't say no to a paw," said the badger, smiling faintly beneath his whiskers. Together, they spent the afternoon climbing over the badger's burrow, hammering in nails, pressing tar between gaps. The work was slow but satisfying, a rhythm of small sounds against the deep quiet of the forest. When they finished, they sat on the slope of the roof, looking out at the rolling hills, the first cold wind brushing through the trees. "You ever think about who built all this?" the otter asked. "The burrow. The whole forest, really. The bridges, the hollow logs, the ponds. Someone must have started it all a long time ago. The badger shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it just grew this way, one den and one path at a time. Like us. The otter nodded. He liked that thought. The forest is something built slowly, through living rather than planning. When a storm came that night, it was heavy and wild. Rain beat the roof like a drum, and thunder rolled over the hills. The otter stayed in the badger's burrow. They had set up a little fire and a pot of chestnut stew, which they ate straight from wooden bowls. Between gusts of wind, they could hear the pond outside, restless and full. The otter found himself thinking again of the letter, sealed and waiting somewhere below that dark water. He wondered if the storm would shift it, roll it deeper into the mud, or push it toward the shallows. It didn't matter, he supposed. The words were part of the place now, the way roots became soil. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest washed and bright. Sunlight glinted off droplets that clung to every branch. The otter went to check the pond. The banks were damp, the reeds bent, but everything else was as it had been. He spotted something curious, though, a new object lodged in the roots of the old willow. It looked like another jar, smaller and covered in moss. He waded in and pulled it free. Inside, sealed tightly, was a wooden acorn carved smooth by paw. A note, too, newer than the last. The handwriting was neat but familiar, and as he turned it in the light, he realized it was the badger's. He looked back toward the burrow. The badger was standing by the doorway, arms folded, trying not to grin. "Took you long enough," he said. "You made this." "Thought it was my turn to add something," said the badger. "Can't have only one story under that pond." The otter smiled, turning the jar in his paws. "You didn't have to hide it like this." "Of course I did," the badger said. "Otherwise it wouldn't be an adventure." They placed it back beneath the water together, the otter diving to set it gently in the soft mud beside the first jar. When he came back up, he said quietly, "You think anyone will ever find these?" The badger thought for a moment. "Maybe, but even if they don't, they'll still be here. And that's enough." Winter crept in soon after. The pond froze at the edges, and snow gathered under the birches. Life slowed, but it didn't stop. The hare came by now and then with wild apples from storage, and a frog, sleepy but awake, told long, rambling stories beside the fire. The otter kept busy repairing the little dock, sweeping snow from the roof, carving spoons and bowls out of driftwood. But every evening, before bed, he would stand at the window, looking out at the frozen pond. The jars lay beneath that smooth, cold mirror, side by side, one old, one new. He imagined the faint outlines of their shapes beneath the surface, like hearts sleeping under glass. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he fancied he could hear the pond sigh, not sadly, but peacefully, the way a place does when it knows it's cared for. When spring finally arrived again, the thaw came fast. Water trickled through the channels of melting snow, filling the streams, waking the reeds. The otter stepped outside one morning to find the pond alive with sound. Frogs croaking, birds calling, water splashing against stone. He grinned, stretching in the sunlight. The world had started over once more, and so had he. The badger was already out by the garden, planting early lettuce and turning soil with a steady paw. "Morning," he called. "Back to work, are we?" "Always," said the otter, joining him with a spade. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the earth dark and soft beneath their claws. When they stopped to rest, the otter looked out at the pond, glimmering through the birches. "You know," he said, "I think Elle would have liked it this way. Quiet, alive, shared." The badger nodded. "Then we're doing it right." And the forest, bright and breathing around them, seemed to agree. The rustle of leaves, the glint of sun through branches, the whisper of the pond's gentle current, all folding together into something that felt, to both of them, like home. That day, when the sky turned to gold and the scent of warm soil filled the air, the otter sat again by the dock, his paws trailing in the water. He didn't need to look for new letters or jars. The pond already spoke in the soft rush of the reeds, in the ring of ripples spreading out, in the quiet company that surrounded him. The forest story would keep going, in ways seen and unseen, as long as there was someone to listen. The following weeks passed in a hush of sunlight and soft rain. Spring deepened, spreading its colors over every inch of the forest. Wild violets along the stream, pale ferns curling open beneath the birches, and clouds of white blossom swaying above the badger's burrow. The otter and the badger spent their mornings working side by side in the garden. The badger's paws were slow but steady, turning the soil in careful rows, while the otter watered seedlings and set up a trellis for beans. There was something satisfying about the rhythm of it. Shovel, water, rest, repeat, and when they paused for tea, they would sit on overturned logs, steam rising from their mugs, the smell of fresh earth between them. Feels like this place breathes deeper every spring, the otter said one morning. The badger nodded. Because you notice it. Most creatures hurry too much to see it happen. The otter smiled faintly, watching a robin dart down and pluck a worm from the soil. Maybe that's why Elle wrote that letter, to remind whoever came next to slow down. Then they succeeded, the badger said, sipping his tea. You're the slowest otter I've ever met. The otter laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather again, low and gray, the air thick with the promise of another spring storm. The otter decided to take a short walk before the rain started. He followed the stream that fed into the pond, winding through alder roots and patches of moss. As he walked, he found small signs of life everywhere. Paw prints in the soft mud, a bird's feather caught on a thorn, the faint sound of a woodpecker echoing through the trees. The forest felt alive in a quiet, old way, as if each creature carried a fragment of its memory. When he reached a small clearing, he stopped. There, near the bank, stood a rotting stump, and beneath it, half buried in leaves, was a piece of old wood shaped into something like a post. Curious, he brushed it off, revealing a bit of weathered carving. It was the faint outline of initials, LB. The otter blinked. Could it be the same L from the letter? The carving was too faded to tell much more, but nearby he noticed the remains of a broken dock, just a few planks, overgrown with moss and wildflowers. His chest warmed. This was it, the place where the letter had been written, where someone long ago had stood watching the same water, the same sky. He sat for a long while, just listening to the stream. There was no need to do anything with the discovery. It was enough simply to know. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he rose and made his way back through the woods, the sound of water all around him, the steady patter of rain on leaves, the soft rush of the stream, the low roll of thunder far away. By the time he returned, the badger had already lit a fire. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said, handing over a towel. Not a ghost, said the otter, drying his fur. A memory. He told the badger about the carving, about the broken dock, about the initials. The badger listened quietly, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. So they were real, the badger said at last. Whoever L was, they really lived here. They did, said the otter softly, and I think they'd be glad to know it's still cared for. The badger smiled. Then we'll keep it that way. The rain continued through the night, steady and soft. The otter fell asleep to the sound of it drumming on the roof and dreamed of the old dock, the letter, and the forest as it must have been long ago. Smaller, quieter, but somehow the same. When he woke, dawn was spilling gold through the window. The air smelled of wet bark and new grass. He brewed tea, then walked to the pond. Mist hovered low over the water, curling like smoke. The surface was calm, a perfect mirror for the pale sky above. Somewhere beneath that stillness lay the two jars, resting side by side, the past and the present sealed together. He sat for a while, sipping slowly. A kingfisher darted low over the pond. Its blue flashed like a stroke of paint on water. Somewhere behind him, the badger's shovel rang against a stone. Life went on, quiet and certain. The otter leaned back and closed his eyes, feeling the sunlight settle warm across his face. He didn't think much about the future. It would come in its own time, and whoever came after would find what they needed. For now, it was enough to sit beside the pond, surrounded by all that had been and all that was: a soft morning, a good friend, and a story that still lingered in the water. Later that day, the frog came hopping down the path, waving a sheet of paper. "Gentlemen," he called, "I have written my memoirs." The badger groaned. "Not this again." The frog ignored him, clearing his throat dramatically. Chapter 1: A Life of Refinement and Adventure. The otter grinned. "That's a bold start." "It's only the truth," said the frog, puffing out his chest. "But I find myself in need of an illustrator. Someone with a delicate paw for artistic matters." "Try the hedgehog," said the badger. "He's got steady paws." "The hedgehog owes me money," the frog muttered. No, it must be one of you." "I could draw," the otter said, humoring him, "but I make no promises about flattery." The frog brightened. "Splendid. We'll begin tomorrow at dawn." The badger chuckled. "Dawn? You never wake before noon." "Then it will be an exception," said the frog primly, turning to leave. "A masterpiece requires sacrifice." As he vanished into the reeds, the badger shook his head. "You're going to regret saying yes." The otter laughed. "Probably, but it might be fun." "Fun and chaos usually come in the same jar," the badger replied. The otter looked toward the pond, still rippling softly under the afternoon light. "Then it'll fit right in." And so the days went on, long, easy, full of small things that mattered more than they seemed. The frog's memoir became a community project. The hare contributed a poem, the badger corrected the grammar, and the otter sketched careful drawings of the pond, the burrow, and their crooked little dock. By the time they finished, summer was just beginning again. And when the first warm breeze passed through the birches, carrying the smell of water and earth, the otter felt something quiet and certain settle inside him. The sense that the story wasn't ending, only turning another page. The pond would keep its secrets, the forest would keep its peace, and he, for as long as he stayed, would keep listening. High summer arrived in a rush of warmth and hum. The forest seemed to vibrate with sound, the endless chorus of cicadas, the flicker of wings in the canopy, the soft burble of water winding through roots and reeds. The air shimmered above the pond, heavy with the scent of wild mint and sun-warmed moss. The otter had taken to spending the hottest hours of the day in the shade beneath a great willow. Its long green curtains swayed over the pond like strands of silk, and from beneath them he could watch the light break into ripples across the surface. Some days the badger would join him, carrying a small basket of lunch, oat bread, slices of apple, and a jar of honey. They would eat slowly, dipping bread into the honey, speaking little. The forest itself seemed to demand quiet in summer. Every sound felt softer, as though even the wind moved carefully so as not to disturb the bees. "Do you ever think the pond remembers?" the otter asked one afternoon, watching dragonflies dance above the reeds. The badger chewed thoughtfully. "Remembers what?" "Everything. Who's lived here? Who's come and gone?" The badger leaned back on his elbows, squinting up at the canopy. "Maybe it does. Or maybe remembering isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about keeping the rhythm going." The otter liked that. He thought of the letter, of the jars beneath the water, of all the small traces that remained. The dock rebuilt, the garden thriving, the paths worn smooth by their steps. It was a rhythm in its own quiet way. One evening, As the sun began to set and the air cooled, the frog arrived looking rather triumphant, balancing a stack of papers on his head. "It is finished," he declared. "My memoir, a true masterpiece of literature and modesty." The badger looked up from his cup of tea. "I thought we finished that weeks ago." "We did," said the frog, "but I have made revisions. Major ones." The otter sighed, half amused. "What kind of revisions?" "I've added more depth, more drama, more me." "That's a terrifying combination," the badger muttered. The frog ignored him, spreading the pages across the table. "Listen to this passage. I leapt heroically from the log, my reflection shining below like a second sun." "You tripped and fell into the pond," said the otter. "Artistic interpretation," replied the frog coolly. "Readers appreciate embellishment." The badger chuckled. "As long as it's someone else's memory you're embellishing." The frog gathered his pages again with dignity. "You two are far too literal. There is no poetry in you." "Oh, there's poetry," said the otter. "It's just quieter than yours." Later that night, after the frog had gone, the otter wandered down to the water. Fireflies floated low over the pond, their reflections flickering like tiny stars. The moon hung high, pale and round, and he could hear the slow chirp of crickets in the grass. He sat at the edge of the dock, paws dangling over the water, and thought about how much the forest had changed since spring. The flowers had come and gone. The frogs had hatched their young. The trees had grown heavy with leaves. Yet beneath it all, the rhythm remained, soft, patient, endless. He wondered how many summers had passed like this, how many small lives had played out along the same pond. It made him feel both small and steady, a single heartbeat in something much larger. The badger joined him a few minutes later, sitting down with a soft grunt. "Can't sleep? Just listening," the otter said. They sat in silence for a while. The pond lapped quietly at the wood. "You ever think about leaving?" the otter asked after a while. "Sometimes," said the badger. "But then I remember that the world moves the same way everywhere. Slow and steady if you're patient enough to notice. I'd rather stay where I know the rhythm." The otter nodded. "Me too." The next morning dawned bright and warm. Mist rose off the pond in thin ribbons that vanished as the sun climbed. The hare came by carrying a basket of blueberries, his fur damp with dew. "Morning, you too," he called. "I found these by the west meadow. Thought they'd go well with porridge." The otter grinned. "Perfect timing. We just made tea." They sat together in the soft grass, passing around bowls and spoons, the air rich with the smell of berries and oats. It was a simple meal, but the hare declared it the finest breakfast in all the forest. "Do you think we'll still be here next summer?" the hare asked suddenly. "All of us." The badger smiled. "I hope so. But even if not, the forest will remember the laughter." The hare nodded, quiet for once. "That's enough for me." The otter watched the sunlight drift across the pond, and for a moment he felt something like gratitude settle deep in his chest. A soft, wordless feeling that didn't need to be spoken. The days stretched long and golden. The frog spent his afternoons reading his memoir aloud to whoever would listen, and occasionally to whoever wouldn't. The hare napped in the clover fields, waking only when the bees grew too noisy. The badger kept the garden in perfect order, and the otter swam, fished, and watched the skies change. When the evenings cooled, they all gathered by the water's edge, sharing small things: a song, a story, a handful of roasted chestnuts. There was no grand plan, no reason other than the joy of being there together. One night, the badger looked up at the stars and said, "We should write another letter." The otter turned toward him. "For the pond." "For whoever comes next," said the badger. "It feels right." So they did. The hare fetched paper. The frog dictated lines about heroic friendship and literary legacy, and the otter wrote carefully, his handwriting looping and steady. We lived by the pond, and it was good. We learned that quiet days can be full ones, that laughter echoes longer than storms, and that the forest keeps what's worth keeping. When they finished, they sealed it in a jar. The otter swam it out once more, letting it sink to rest beside the others. 3 jars now, 3 pieces of time sleeping under the water. He watched until the ripples faded, then swam back to shore. The others were waiting, their faces warm in the lantern light. "Do you think they'll ever find them?" asked the hare softly. "Someday," said the otter, "when the forest is ready." And for a moment, as the frogs began to sing and the night wind stirred the reeds, it felt as though the pond itself was listening. Patient, ancient, and alive. The seasons would keep turning, as they always did. The letters would stay sealed in the still water. The forest would grow and fade and grow again, and the rhythm would continue, slow and kind and steady. And above it all, in that small pocket of peace beneath the willow, life would go on in the only way that mattered, quietly, together. Thank you for wandering through the woods with me. If you'd like to return for more quiet stories and soft moments, don't forget to follow the trail back. Like, subscribe, and I'll meet you again under the green canopy soon.